I want to be honest with you about something that has been sitting with me for a while now. The Cleveland Browns quarterback competition has already been decided in the court of public opinion, and I think that is a problem. Not because the conventional wisdom is necessarily wrong about everything, but because the people delivering it are not being straight with you about what is actually happening inside that building. You turn on the morning shows, and the story is always the same version of itself. Watson is the starter. The competition is a procedural formality. The rookie is there to learn, to watch, to carry a clipboard and absorb information and wait his turn. And I understand why that story has grip. It is tidy, it fits the organizational logic, and $46 million is a number that carries enormous institutional weight regardless of what happens on a practice field. But I have been watching the footage. I have been reading the evaluator language. I have been tracking what the beat reporters are saying, and more importantly, how the way they are saying it has started to shift. And what I can tell you right now, plainly and directly, is that this competition is not settled. Not remotely. And the person making it unsettled is a 23-year-old who is building a case so methodically and so honestly that the people most invested in the other outcome are running out of ways to ignore it. Let me take you back to where the actual story begins, because the context is everything, and I think it gets stripped away too quickly when people reach for the box score. Week 12 of the 2025 NFL regular season. Cleveland versus Las Vegas. The Browns walked into that game at 2-8. 2 wins in 11 tries. That is not a team having a difficult season in the way that contenders sometimes have difficult stretches. That is a franchise that had, by every internal and external signal, already closed the chapter on its year. The fan base had emotionally moved on. The national media had stopped engaging with the team as a serious football story and started engaging with it as a punchline about front office dysfunction and contract disasters. Players in that locker room had begun operating with the detached energy of men whose minds were already somewhere warmer. The organization had gone quiet in the specific way that only losing teams go quiet when the acceptance has set in. That was the environment Shedeur Sanders walked into for his first full NFL start. I want you to actually feel what that moment required, because glossing over it does a disservice to what happened next. A young quarterback stepping into that huddle for the first time is not just managing the normal weight of a debut. He is managing teammates who have stopped fully caring. He is managing a crowd that showed up out of habit more than hope. He is managing a defense on the other side of the field that spent an entire week dissecting his college tape, cataloging every mechanical habit, every footwork pattern, every coverage tendency that 4 years of film could reveal. And then the Raiders made the moment harder before a single play ran. They sent a blitz, 3rd and 8. Extra rushers, compressed pocket timing, maximum pressure on a first-start quarterback who had every reason in the world to feel the weight of the situation and let it affect his processing. They were daring him to blink. He did not blink. He read the blitz developing in front of him, felt the protection adjusting, used his feet to slide away from the initial rush without retreating into chaos, reset his platform with a composure that veteran quarterbacks take years to develop, and delivered a 52-yard completion to rookie receiver Isaiah Bond. Not a prayer into open space, not a jump ball contested at the boundary. A precisely timed, deliberately placed football thrown into the correct window with the velocity and trajectory to put it where only his receiver could bring it down. Coaches rewound that tape. Of course they did. That is the kind of throw that makes an offensive coordinator stop the film mid-play and sit with what he just watched before moving on. And here is the number that keeps getting buried in the broader conversation about that game. That 52-yard completion was not just the longest throw Shedeur made in his debut. It was the longest pass play any Cleveland Browns quarterback generated in the entire 2025 regular season. Any quarterback. Over a full year of football games. A 23-year-old in his very first start against a blitz on a 2-win team with a demoralized locker room threw the longest completion the Browns produced all season. Cleveland won that game 24-10, and by every account that came out afterward, something changed inside that building. Players who had mentally started their offseason came back to the facility the following week carrying different energy. That kind of shift is not something you can draw up on a whiteboard. It either happens or it doesn't. It happened the moment Shedeur Sanders stepped into that huddle. Now move forward to the spring. OTAs 2026. Completely different setting, completely different evaluation context, entirely new window of observation. And the same descriptive language starts appearing again from people with no connection to each other and no reason to coordinate their framing. The second OTA session produces a throw that gets described by people physically present on that field as an absolute dart. Threaded through tight coverage, past a defender's outstretched hand, dropped into a spot that only the intended receiver could access. And I want to spend a moment on why the specific word choices matter here. Because in professional football evaluation, language is data. When trained observers, whose entire professional function is to watch quarterbacks throw footballs, people who have seen thousands of repetitions across years of covering this sport, when those people independently reach for the same vocabulary to describe the same player in completely different contexts months apart, that is not a narrative being manufactured. That is documentation. They are not running a shared talking point. They are not building a media story together behind closed doors. They are individually watching the same quality and calling it what it is from their own professional frameworks, and those frameworks keep producing the same words. Zach Jackson was standing on that field during the second OTA session, not watching a replay, not receiving a second-hand account. He was present, and his assessment afterward carried no hedging, no projection language, no qualifications about what might develop over time. He said directly that accuracy is Shedeur Sanders' superpower. Present tense. That is not a statement about future potential. That is an observation about a demonstrated current reality. Nathan Zagura, the Browns' own color analyst, someone whose professional credibility depends entirely on not applying evaluative language carelessly, watched the same practice window and called two separate technical qualities elite. Ball placement, elite. The ability to vary throw depths and velocities within a single possession, elite. You do not reach for that word without being certain of what you are watching, because in this business, misusing it costs you credibility, and people remember. 3 independent professional voices, all physically on site, all arriving at the same conclusions without coordinating their messaging. That is a pattern, and patterns built from independent sources in this sport carry real weight. But the development I find most analytically significant is the one involving Mary Kay Cabot, and I want to give this the attention it deserves rather than mentioning it in passing. If you follow the Cleveland beat, you know exactly what she represents in this specific conversation. For months, she was the most consistent and most detailed voice constructing the Deshaun Watson narrative. Watson has the inside track. The job is his to lose. The organization is providing him every legitimate pathway to win the starting role. She built that story carefully and persistently across the entire offseason arc. So when she appeared live on 92.3 The Fan after the second OTA session and described Shedeur Sanders' repetition in the choice drill as a really nice moment and a good sign for him in the competition, I need you to understand what that actually represents. That is a live, public, unretractable course correction from the reporter most professionally committed to the opposing outcome. That is not token balance drop to seem fair. That is someone watching something she genuinely could not fit inside her existing framework and choosing to say so honestly, rather than forcing the angle. When the person who spent the spring building the Watson narrative pivots on air and calls the rookie's rep a good sign, the accuracy argument is no longer theoretical. Then the numbers, because this is where the counter-narrative encounters its most serious structural problem, and I want to be precise. Across the 5 open OTA and mandatory minicamp practice sessions in 2026, Shedeur Sanders completed 41 of 53 passes, 77.4%, 9 touchdowns. And that completion percentage was the highest mark among all 4 quarterbacks in the evaluation room, not second highest, highest. Deshaun Watson, the quarterback carrying $46 million in organizational commitment, the quarterback the media consensus says has already won a competition that has not finished, did not post 77.4%. Neither did the other 2 quarterbacks in that room. The rookie with one official NFL start led the entire competition in the most fundamental accuracy measurement available. The single interception in that statistical window came on a deflected pass in a 7-on-7 drill. The football was tipped at the line of scrimmage. A defender's hand redirected the trajectory after the ball had already left his fingertips. That is not a decision error. That is not a coverage misread or a moment where pressure fractured his processing. That is a physics problem that happens to every quarterback at every level of this sport, and anyone using it as meaningful evaluative evidence against him is not watching this with honest eyes. The full picture across this evaluation window is this: best completion percentage in the room, 9 touchdown passes, 1 tip deflection, and the longest single pass play any Browns quarterback created during an entire regular season on his very first NFL start. That is the record the Watson narrative now has to compete against. I am genuinely trying to understand how it does. I have heard the counter-argument, and I will not pretend it carries no weight, because it does. The financial commitment is real. $46 million does not get set aside by any ownership group without significant emotional resistance. Peter Schrager, who has genuine relationships inside NFL buildings, said on Get Up that the organizational plan is to give Watson every legitimate opportunity to win the job and keep it. That framing reveals something uncomfortable about where the decision-making pressure actually originates. When an owner is financially and emotionally anchored to a specific outcome, that pressure does not stay contained at the top. It moves downward through the front office and into the coaching staff in ways that rarely get announced openly. Todd Monken is 60 years old, and this is his first NFL head coaching position. The pull toward an established veteran, toward someone with a recognizable name, toward someone who was genuinely one of the better quarterbacks in the league back in 2020, that pull is human, and I understand it completely. Career preservation instincts are real, and they are not unique to football. I am not going to mock that hesitation because it makes sense from a certain vantage point. But here is what I cannot move past when I try to look at this clearly. 2020 was 6 years ago. Watson has appeared in just 22% of his possible starts across the last 5 years in Cleveland. 22%. And in the games he has actually played during that stretch, the quarterback who has shown up has been a measurably diminished version of the player Houston built their franchise around. The anticipation is reduced. The explosiveness that made him dangerous in open space is largely gone. The precision that defined his best work in Houston has been replaced by something more inconsistent and more reactive. Meanwhile, the 23-year-old sitting in that evaluation room is posting 77.4%, 9 touchdowns in a spring window, and a debut performance that produced the single biggest explosive play any quarterback on that roster managed to create across an entire season. That gap is not subtle, and it is not getting smaller. There is a dimension of this story that consistently gets talked around rather than addressed directly, and I want to address it. Multiple evaluators have said, in different ways, that his most significant quality might not be the arm or the accuracy metrics or the mechanical refinement visible on film. It might be what happens to the environment around him when he is operating inside it. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like the kind of soft narrative filler that gets deployed when the hard evidence runs thin. But follow the actual evidence before you dismiss it. A 2-8 Browns team that had emotionally abandoned its season watched one throw, one single play on 3rd and 8 in a debut start, and by multiple accounts, the energy inside that franchise shifted overnight. Players who had mentally started their vacation came back to the facility the following week carrying genuine investment again. You cannot scheme that. You cannot hire a consultant who produces that. Either someone has that quality, or they do not. Pull the thread across his entire football life, and the pattern holds. Every team environment Shedeur Sanders has entered has elevated around him. Colorado under his father's rebuild is the most visible example, but it is not the only one. People around him play better. The collective belief in what is possible inside a locker room rises. That specific quality, the quality that elevates teammate investment simply through proximity to someone who genuinely and completely believes in what he is doing, is the hardest single thing to find anywhere in professional sports. Organizations spend decades looking for it. Most never locate it. One evaluator framed it in a way that I thought was the most direct version of the real question. If both quarterbacks played their absolute best football in a fair evaluation, which one do you build the next decade around? That evaluator's answer was Shedeur, and the reasoning was not purely mechanical. It was the completion percentage, and it was the touchdown numbers, and it was the arm on the 52-yard throw against a blitz in his debut. But it was also the composure he carries with reporters while listed as the third-string quarterback on his own roster. The poise of someone who has processed the situation and decided it does not change how he operates. He does not manufacture controversy. He does not push back against the structure that has him behind a quarterback who has barely played in 5 years. He shows up to that practice field and throws the football well and lets the work speak for itself. That is not a media strategy. That is character. Every organization that let 142 selections pass before Cleveland called his name is watching this from a distance right now. They are pulling up the Raiders' game film. They are reading the evaluator quotes and noticing that trained independent professionals are landing on the same language months apart in different contexts. They are watching the beat reporter who constructed the Watson narrative pivot on live radio. They are looking at that 77.4% completion rate sitting at the top of the room's evaluation window. And every one of those organizations is sitting somewhere in their own facility, arriving at some version of the same uncomfortable thought. Maybe the institutional wait holds long enough to delay what looks increasingly like a reckoning. Maybe Watson gets the Week 1 start and the ownership convinces itself the investment deserves one more runway. Those are real possibilities, and I am not dismissing them. But the accuracy does not disappear. The leadership quality that brought a dead locker room back to life does not disappear. The ball placement and the layered throws and the ability to process a blitz with the calm of someone who has seen it before, none of that goes anywhere regardless of what the depth chart says in August. What I am asking is simple. Look at this honestly. Do not let the institutional narrative override what trained evaluators who stood on that practice field are telling you in their own words. Do not let sunk cost logic bend statistical evidence that is clear and documented and sitting right there in plain view. The pattern across independent sources, across different contexts, across months of observation is consistent enough that this stopped being a conversation about potential some time ago. This is now a conversation about timing. Shedeur Sanders is already doing the work. The only question Cleveland has left to answer is how long they intend to wait before letting him do it where it actually counts.